Welcome everybody to the Remote Property Investing community, and this is going to be repurposed to my podcast once I launch it. But today I'm super excited that Gavin has joined me, and I'm super honoured as well that Gavin's joined me to do a quick interview today about his story, his past. So I stumbled across Gavin on Clubhouse, and this is the new app. If nobody's not heard of Clubhouse yet, or you're not on it, come from behind the rock that you're hiding from and get yourself on there. And this is a prime example of how people can connect really easily, the connectability of Clubhouse. So I'm quite humbled to admit this, and I'm excited to admit this. I like being around people that are in front of me. So if I'm now on my journey, Gavin's way up there on his journey, and he's not that much older than me. So he's what I could, at my age, he definitely was still up there compared to where I was. It's not like I'm on a trajectory to catch him up, but it shows you that power of connection. In the normal old world, connecting to somebody that quickly like Gavin would have been a lot more difficult than it would have been. But we was in a few rooms together, spoke to Gavin on Instagram, on Messenger, and he quite kindly agreed to jump on this. I'm not going to... As I said, I've only just stumbled across Gavin recently. So what I started doing is doing a bit of research, and I realised there's lots and lots of avenues of Gavin's life that he's done. So I thought, you know what, I did do some research. I've naturally done that before I even asked Gavin to jump on with me with this, but because I was quite interested with Gavin. But that said, I'm going to hand it over for you, Gavin, to just explain your little backstory. I know you've told this loads of times in Clubhouse, but for the people that are not on there yet, the ones that are behind the rocks or these Android users, if you don't mind sharing, I'll give you a quick intro. So Gavin is his main thing at the moment, I believe, although he's got lots of things, is bespoke corporate office and working solutions. So he's got tenants like Google, which is ginormous, isn't it? Just to say that's on your CV, Google's my tenant is massive. He's a real estate investor, developer. He's an author, keynote speaker, podcast. He's got a lot of things going on. So I'll pass it over to you, Gavin, if you don't mind introducing yourself and then just sharing that little backstory how I come across you with your little journey, please, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure, Harvey. Well, I mean, obviously, this all starts with Clubhouse, and I think we're all possibly getting a bit fed up of Clubhouse. It's dominating our lives so much at this stage. I mean, it's like literally, I was on the other night, and I just popped into a room. There was an American audience there, and I just popped into the room, and next minute I was invited up on stage by this guy, JT Fox, I think his name is.
Yeah, I know, yeah.
And JT has like 120,000 followers, and he invited me up on stage, and I was like, what? I was actually like lying in bed, kind of thinking to myself, I'll just listen to, Clubhouse for a few minutes. And next minute I'm invited on stage, and it's like, okay, we got Gavin on stage now. And I'm just like, what? I had to jump out of bed, kind of like wake up, shake myself off and get ready to speak, So it's really taking over the world to a degree. And I wonder how sustainable it is for everyone to kind of stay so engaged. We'll have to see. Going into my story, I've got quite a long story, 25 years in the real estate business. But today I run a business park in Dublin called East Point Business Park, and it's a big place that myself and my family, we actually developed this park from the ground up. We got involved. In fact, it was my father was involved in it before he died, and bought the site. It was actually a former municipal dump. A landfill site, and we bought this old landfill site of 40 acres, and over about 20 years it took us to remediate the land and then basically get it prepared and master plan it to build 37 buildings on it, and then the 37 buildings to lease those buildings out and find investors and hold on to some of them ourselves. So we have a combination of tenants ranging from Google and Oracle to Deutsche Bank, and I mean, just you name it, a big long list of multinational businesses. And then we have some smaller domestic kind of businesses based in Ireland here, but it's mostly international businesses that have a headquarters in Ireland and would be trading internationally. Go back a couple of years, and the story that seems to have got a lot of interest and traction in Clubhouse is back when I was in my 20s, my father died, and I got kind of thrown in the deep end, involved in the family business. The family business was this kind of big kind of thing that was just a little bit too much too soon. And so I started doing my own thing, and I started basically dabbling in the property business. I was an architect by training, and I bought a couple of sites, and it was during the Celtic Tiger. For anyone who's not familiar, the Celtic Tiger was this crazy period when Ireland was playing catch up, having sort of joined the Eurozone. And we basically went from having interest rates at kind of 8 or 9% to suddenly dropping down to like 1%. And there was just this massive catch up in land values and everything like that. And I was just riding that wave like everybody else. But I got into a couple of deals and just, made incredible money very, very quickly. And I was also pretty ambitious in wanting to grow very, very rapidly. So I borrowed money at the times the banks were shoveling it out the door like it was good no tomorrow. And I was, a couple of deals, just to kind of give you an idea, bought a property in a kind of rough part of the working class Dublin, bought it in November. And by January, I had already agreed to sell it on to another financial institution for a 2.5 million profit in just 6 weeks. And I didn't put a cent of my own money into that deal. It was all borrowed money. So the IRRs were just off the map, and took some of that money, rolled it into another deal, made 4x on that deal with the money, put it into another deal, made 2x on that deal. And it just kind of ramped up really, really rapidly. And got to the point where I was bringing in like $1 million a year in passive income. I was 35 years of age, living in a 7-bedroom mansion in the best part of Dublin. And I had bought a house in Spain, and I was basically relocating to Spain, kind of almost like semi-retirement in a sense, at 35 years of age with a 65 million portfolio. And I just thought to myself, I figured it out. Like I've unlocked the magic formula for making money easily. And that's the kind of mindset that I was in. And then along came 2008, and the financial recession that came after that was just absolutely like a freight train running through the middle of my dreams and plans and everything. And I got knocked really badly. 3 years into that recession, I was 16 million underwater, 3 different banks chasing me, going after me, basically forcing me to sell assets, doing all sorts of stuff. My marriage broke down as a result of the stress and strain that the two of us were under and all that. And it was just a horrendous couple of years, very humbling. I mean, there was a point when my income was actually completely frozen, and I had zero, and I had to go and rely on family to help bail me out. So it was this incredible kind of ramp up. And then, basically like what is it they say, the old Greek god that flew too close to the sun and the wings melted off and he fell to earth. That's pretty much what happened to me. And it was an incredibly difficult time. And what I realized was kind of at the worst point, when it was kind of the low point, is that there's no point in blaming everyone else for the predicament you're in. I kind of realized that there's nobody here is going to bail me out. There's no rescue plan. It's up to me to sort myself out. And the very first thing I need to do is take kind of ownership for the situation I'm in. I'd spent a couple of years licking my wounds and blaming like the economy, blaming the banks, blaming all these other people for the predicament I was in. And it was only when I kind of said, you know what, that's all bullshit. I'm to blame. It was me who borrowed all that money. It was me who, decided that I liked this lifestyle with, caviar and champagne and flying first class everywhere. And that was all on me. And it was time to kind of put the ego back in the box and just decide, to get humble and try to kind of rebuild things. And so it has taken a couple of years, but, finally things are on the mend and on the recovery. But it is a humbling thing. And I've decided kind of make my mission to make people aware of just how dangerous debt and over leverage can be, and the mindset. If you don't get your mindset right, you will walk right into this same problem. A lot of people are out there, as soon as they get a good deal, they're out buying things, and they're starting to kind of like use the Instagram comparison lifestyle. Look at me, look at the Range Rover I've just bought, whatever it is. And that is a very dangerous path to go down. And so I kind of caution people to look at look at this as a long-term journey, not this sort of short-term thing where you can become really rich overnight, because what goes up quickly can come down just as quickly, and you got to kind of remember that.
Yeah, for sure. And there's a couple of bits. The thing is, with success, sometimes it can breed complacency. Then it's like a drug. Like the more successful you are, the more we're emotional beings. We do things emotionally, and then we try and justify it logically afterwards. And that success releases endorphins, and exactly the same as we would if we was doing a drug or anything. So we get kind of high on that. And the same as if you was drinking or doing a drug, it sort of blinds your judgment a little bit, doesn't it? You know, like your current success can be one of the biggest threats to your future successes, because you get complacent. But you say about gearing as well, but you wasn't massively over geared either. I remember you saying in one of the clubhouse rooms, your gearing on the portfolio wasn't ginormous.
40. Yeah, it was not particularly bad. I'll tell you where the problem was, is that I was combining good income producing assets with development land. And it was all, the problem is, back in those days, the tax advice was own everything in your own name, because the capital gains tax was much lower than if you do it through a company. Yes, you have the limited, protection, the limited liability protection of the company, but the company has to pay the capital gains tax. And then for you to get your hands on the income or the profit, you've got to go and pay yourself out. And either that's a salary at about 50% tax, or it's a second, it's a big dividend, and you're going to just get taxed to the nose. So the tax advice kind of started drifting over a couple of years of continued growth and everything. And people started realizing, geez, I'm paying so much tax with my company, with my profits locked away in the company. Why don't I just do away with that silly company and like do everything in my own personal name? And so that's what I did. And so I had this huge income coming from all these terrific assets. I owned a load of bank properties that were rented to banks for like long leases, and there were branches that I built for banks and stuff. But I also had development projects underway, and one particular development project, it was just a hole in the ground, and so you're not going to be able to do anything with that. You're not going to be able to sell it. You're not going to be able to do, and that's, in fact, we couldn't even develop it because the banks stopped lending the money for the actual development. So now you're carrying just this hole in the ground and the interest on that. And it was a combination of all of that just started to kind of eat away at the amount of income that I had available to pay down debt and stuff. So you do have to watch carefully your debts and your cash flow, and also just your position. I mean, I went into a situation where I was paying 15,000 a month loan interest on a loan, and I thought to myself, it's a lot, but I can manage it, because in about 6 to 9 months' time, I'll have sold that property and I'll have made a 2 million profit. And so that 15 grand a month I can live with, And what happened then is the recession came along. The deal that I had to sell it for 2 million fell out of bed. And suddenly I'm into 15 grand a month for a prolonged period of time. And that's when it really starts. And like the value of the property is falling. Now you can't sell it for any profit. And now you're carrying 15 grand a month whilst you're waiting for the property price to return above water again. So it was a lot of that kind of just being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The market in Ireland was totally decimated because of the credit bubble that had been created by all of this, loose borrowing and stuff. And we had just the banks were massively over borrowed. They just lent out too much money. And I was a small fish in the big pond. Like the pond was filled with guys that had 2 and 3 billion worth of borrowings. And I actually know 1 or 2 of them. And those guys actually went for full bankruptcy. And, to go from being a billionaire to being fully bankrupt, it's quite an amazing thing. So my journey is like small by comparison to some of these guys,
but large in comparison to some others. There's always that comparable sometimes. But again, it gets to a good point. I was going to ask this a little bit further in, but where it's led this way, I think about managing risk is the most important thing that I say to people. And exactly what you said there about the 15k payments, that's what I say. Look, everything's a risk. You've got a risk, or you're never going to move forward. No risk, no gain. But the larger the rewards, the larger the risk is. And what I try and say to people is you've got to manage them risks, what you can afford. So if you bet your shirt which is if you can't afford them 15k a month development finance, and the deal goes wrong, the market's changing, the deal goes wrong, and that's going to eat away at you when you can't afford them and bankrupt you. That's potentially a risk too far. If you buy a property and you think, you know what, if it all goes wrong, the payments on this are £500 a month, I can cover that. I don't want to cover that, but that's a calculated risk, what I feel in my head. How do you calculate risk now going forward with the experience that you've got?
Well, the big issues that I found with the real estate business in general, and especially in the development business, is that the time it takes to go from an idea to actually delivering a building and tenants renting it, and you either sell it on or you start collecting the rent, it can be 3 years, it can be 4 years. There's quite a time frame, and so because of that, it's always advisable to have multiple projects on at different time scales. So you would be buying something today that you're going to have to go through that 4-year process. So rather than waiting 4 years until you have some money, you'll have started something else a year or two before that, which will be further along. Yeah. And then you'll have started something possibly before that, which will be nearing completion then. So you're delivering a deal today, you're getting paid, and that money that you're getting paid will help fund some of the work that you're doing 2 years away and then 4 years away. And so there was that kind of leapfrog, you're constantly one deal or two deals ahead. And the problem is that it's that knock-on impact, is that when I was looking at that 15 grand a month, I was looking exclusively at that 15 grand a month. And I was thinking, okay, I can do this. This is not going to damage the finances too badly. The problem is when that went down, it had this other impact of taking that deal down as just one part of the overall jigsaw. Then the other deals start to run into difficulty, and the bank that lent me on this is suddenly starting to worry about that one. And it's having that global viewpoint on all of your assets rather than just looking at one deal. You've got to think, okay, is this one deal that I'm looking at, is it ring fenced so it cannot contaminate your other stuff? And the problem with owning everything in your own name, in my case, was it could contaminate everything. And I had this fabulous portfolio built up, like millions and millions in property, tons and tons of passive income coming in. I should have been absolutely away, safe, completely safe. But it was that contamination of those development sites that were also in my personal name that drifted in. And suddenly the banks are looking at the whole thing as one big portfolio and saying, right, well, why don't we sell those nice income producing assets to help fund this asset that is underwater and not coming out of the water for a couple of years? And that's where you started to get into difficulties. What I should have done is had multiple, limited companies, and also being more conservative with, like, I had so many deals, in the air. I kind of considered myself to be, these guys that spin plates at the stuff. I had like 7 or 8 plates spinning, and I was kind of like, you spin one and the other one is like wobbling and you have to go back to the other one. And that's the way it was, like constantly onto the next one, onto the next one. And that was what my life was like. And that was one of the reasons why I had done so well, was because I was juggling 7 or 8 deals at any one time. And when it was all going great, it's 7 or 8 deals all making you money. But when one goes wrong and it starts to contaminate all the others, that's when you can suddenly have 7 or 8 deals all going wrong simultaneously. And so you do have to put ring fence certain assets, protect yourself, make sure. And sometimes that costs money, or it costs opportunity. I mean, if you go and put those assets into a limited liability protection of a company, there's going to be added tax cost there. So you have to think to yourself, well, do I mind taking a loss of some leakage on the tax in return for the safety of not contaminating? And you kind of say, you know what, yes, I've got so much to lose now that this is not something I'm prepared to risk. And so a bit of tax leakage is fine. But you got to think to yourself that the market today could be very, very different in 3, 4, 5 years time. And the stuff you're doing today is baked into your outcome 5 years from now. So, you think to yourself, what I'm doing today is great, but what you're doing today is you're not gonna know the result for 4 or 5 years. And you've got to think that, who's to say Brexit or COVID or whatever, 5 years ago, there was people doing deals that had no idea COVID or Brexit would actually arrive on your doorstep when you're coming to the end of your deal. And that could have thrown a major spanner in the works. And so,
yeah, there's still so much uncertainty as well, isn't there? Like, as you said, in a 4 or 5 year time, you just don't know what's going to happen. That leads on to my next question. I know you're around prop tech and prop tech. What's your views around prop tech and the disruption we're going into? So at the moment, I love Ray Dalio, and Ray Dalio says so many people have got a narrow view of what's going on in the economy because they can only see, we're emotional beings, so we just go through what we've lived through and we base our emotions off of that. He said, but when you zoom out, there's a bigger picture of things happening. So for me, when I'm looking at this, especially in the UK, so you've got London that's been the main capital hub for so long. It's been a driver, it's been a world city, it's been a driving force. But then if you rewind back when UK was the world leading power, we had the empire of the world before World War II, when we was a reserve currency and everything. The UK, when we was a producing nation, we was pretty even. So Liverpool had the main docks, we had the steel in the north, Hartlepool, I believe, I don't know how true this is, but I've heard this, it produced more millionaires than any other place in the UK because of also Darlington with the rails, we had the industry, we had the production. So the UK was pretty evenish. There wasn't this north-south divide because we were a producing nation. But then at the end of World War II, we lost all the production stuff. We lost the steel to Carnegie, coal started transforming. So there was a massive shift in where we was as a nation, but there's also a shift in that leading power, and there's also a shift in we've gone from hunter-gatherers to agricultural revolution to the industrial revolution, and this is where I feel we're at with prop tech and just tech in general. We're shifting into another revolution. So many people, I asked a question around London. I think I asked you in a Clubhouse room before, and people go, London will be fine, it's always been fine. But I go to people, but it's never been 18 times the wage before with this bubble of debt, with the interest rates pushed down so low. So in my view, unless there's foreign investment keeping coming into London, home buyers can't afford that. Majority of home owners are like the millennials, and they bought their own in 1970s for 15 grand when the debt to the earnings to property ratio, the PE ratio, was around 3 times, so it wasn't a massive gap. So we've never sat in this point in history. But in my view, prop tech is going to give this a massive disruption, as well as the fact we're right at the end of a long-term debt cycle. Where do you see this going? Can you see some big releveler, or what's your views around it and the impact of prop tech and tech in general, AI, machine learning in general?
Yeah, well, I do think that it is definitely, the world is changing before our eyes. And one of the things that's really noticeable is that there was trends that were going in one direction anyway. Technology was, you only have to look at the way the retail sector has been impacted by the likes of Amazon and online shopping and stuff. And so there is a trajectory there, and there's this kind of slope that the market is going in. And, it would have taken 10 years to have the impact that the pandemic has had in just a year. What has happened after the pandemic is, first of all, working from home has massively increased to we're probably gone ahead 6 or 8 years to where we would have been. There's a lot of other stuff as well. I mean, if you look at just the amount of debt that the government has taken on, just to pay all of these kind of furlough schemes and people out of work and stuff, we have jumped forward probably 20 to 30 years in terms of the amount of debt that we've taken on. And so that is going to be a big problem. I do think there's going to be taxation and all sorts of problems. Technology is one area where it can totally transform things. And now, not always for good, obviously, depending on where you are situated. It's a little bit like when you're doing a deal in property. One thing to remember always is that money isn't destroyed, it just simply changes hands. There's a buyer and there's a seller, and depending on where you are in the market cycle, you're either going to be the winner or the loser in the transaction. You won't know on the day of the transaction, but you'll know within a year or two whether or not that was a good deal. And it's the same in with technology and stuff. If you're in a job that is likely to be replaced by technology or machine learning or AI in a couple of years, which is very likely. I mean, I believe that we're going to be seeing driverless cars on the roads not that far away. I mean, we might say, oh, that's 10 years away. 10 years away is not that far away. 10 years away, like I can remember my daughters at the age of 7 and 8, and now I have 16-year-old, and I think to myself, geez, where did that decade go? And so there is change afoot, and it's coming really, really fast. And you've got to make sure that you are tooling yourself up to be in that position. And one of the things in terms of our real estate, business, is that technology is definitely shifting the way business is done. I mean, you only have to look at the way people are now looking at buildings, and even your house, how you buy a house now, how you find a house. It used to be that you walk down the street to your auctioneer or your estate agent, and you look in their window and you kind of see, oh, there's a house for sale. That's all being replaced by the guys that have the portals on the phone or whatever. Those guys that have those offices with 150 branches all around the country that are selling those in the window, those companies have all been devastated by this. Like, they're the early guys that are starting to feel the pain, but there's an awful lot more disruption coming. If you consider the way houses are built, you've got bricklayers and you've got roofers and you've got guys that put in windows and toilets and all of that stuff there. I think that we're moving towards prefabrication in factories, and that a lot of the stuff that's done on site by laborers and stuff, that's going to all become automated, and you're going to move to a much more sort of automated version of it. And so that's something that I think an awful lot of people possibly don't think about. If you're a bricklayer, perhaps your days of actually doing that kind of stuff, that'll become more of like a craft, and you'll be a person who, oh, I know somebody who can do bricklaying, would you like to do a little wall in your back garden or something? But it won't be to the scale that they have been in the past. And so you really need to think through your business. And I think as property investors, I'm up dealing with big corporations and businesses now that are multinationals. They're all very, very much focused on the way the climate change and carbon emissions and all that. They're all super focused on that, and they're asking me an awful lot of questions around how's the energy from the building being generated? How is where's the water? How much water are we using? The waste that we're putting out the back, is that waste going to recycling or is it going to landfill? Like, this stuff is only just the beginning of a trend that we're starting to see. And it won't be long before your building is not considered to be green enough to be rented by your tenants. And so unless you're looking at this and saying, okay, how can I upgrade the building in advance of that happening? Because if you wait till the building until the tenant moves out, then you got to spend all of this money and you got to try and attract the tenant back in. Whereas when the tenant is there, you can be making incremental improvements so that the tenant stays, hopefully. And now that is all. You might think that I invest in single lets or multi-let HMOs and stuff. That doesn't apply to me. I actually think it's going to apply to you just maybe a year or two down the road. And I think that global warming and climate change, I think that's very real. And I think it's coming, and it's going to be a little bit like the pandemic has hit us completely unexpectedly. And you suddenly say, geez, if we had known what we know now, would we have spent 500 million on pandemic preparations? Of course you would have, because you wouldn't have had to spend 20 billion on fixing the situation after it's gone badly, but at the time it looks expensive. Because you kind of think to yourself, why would I spend all this? Is it really necessary? Now with climate change, something similar is happening, and the ice caps are starting to melt. The permafrost up in the North Pole and all of that stuff is starting to kind of happen. It's happening very slowly, very incrementally, and everyone's saying, "Oh, that's not years away. That's not a problem." Suddenly, there's going to be this point where governments around the world have got to pay attention. And that's going to be a point where it's suddenly, Jesus, we're going to have to go and start taxing all these investors. We're going to have to start forcing houses to go and put in energy, say, boiler systems that are, fueled passively or whatever it is. There's all sorts of stuff that's suddenly going to have to be done. And I think unless you're paying attention to this, you're going to be caught asleep at the wheel with no, reserve fund put aside to make these improvements to your buildings. So I think everybody up and down has to start paying attention to this, whether it's environmental sustainability or whether it's prop tech innovation, changes to the way things are done, changes to the way leases are done. I mean, in our business here, it used to be that we signed a lease for 25 years and then goodbye, give me a call in 25 years when the building is ready to be handed back. Now they're looking for 8 years because the business has changed so rapidly that they're not prepared to sign anything that's 25 years long. So we've had to adapt to that. And there's going to be further adaptation now with people moving to flex options and co-working and all that. And we're starting to see tenants saying to us that, in a year or two's time, they won't be renewing their lease. They're planning to pull out of the building and move into flexible options. And we're saying, geez, how do we get out ahead of this curve? Now, I've been looking at it for a year or two, so it's not a complete shock to me. But to some of my, directors that I work with, this is all quite shocking because they thought that the status quo was just going to be the status quo. And so I do think you need to adopt a mindset of some, that is very much change can happen. It can happen suddenly. And you need to be a student and you need to be, don't assume you know everything. Constantly be out there learning what's going on, get curious what's happening in the world, and look for the kind of stuff that could be massively disruptive for your business and start to implement that stuff. Like disrupt yourself before somebody else comes along and disrupts you.
Yeah, for sure. And I love the saying from Darwin, it's not the smartest or the strongest of the species that survive, it's the ones that are most willing to adapt to change. And for sure, I think for myself, I'm really studying it. I'm not surprised what's happening. COVID, I agree with you, definitely fast forwarded that loads, but this is definitely coming, all this disruption, even to the point when you said, like, one of the big things I found in property in the UK especially is planning has never been there. So there's been so much difficulty in planning. So Boris now is saying build. He's releasing it up, making planning a lot easier. There's so many sites we can build on in the UK, not Greenbelt, that's not been built on because of the planning issues. But you said you matched that with prefabrication houses. There's even in Japan, this guy's built this big robot that can lay bricks. And he laid a brick house. This robot laid its first brick house in 48. I can't remember how quick, but it was 48 hours. So they just programmed it in the dimensions, and it just went away. And they bricked up this house in 48 hours. I think that it took humans to point it, but that's probably coming afterwards. So if we can produce houses much faster, we can then get planning, and some of these sites are much more applicable. This supply and demand thing can slowly just start slipping out. So I could see that definitely being a big impact on the property world, but the whole world in general. And as you said, especially with the green factors coming in, I think so many people just get comfortable where they're at the moment, and they as I said, that's today's success can be really dangerous to your future success, because you just get complacent because you just don't think it's going to happen. I really like them points.
I have a friend based in California who has he's an Irish guy, built a business here in Ireland, got it really, really successful, sold it for 100 million and moved to America. And he's doing something similar now, but on an American scale. And he is able to build houses in a factory and brings them to site. And you can go from basically having your concrete foundation to a fully enclosed house within 4 days. And it's incredible. And he's just, he's doing incredibly well. He'll go and do that again. Now, he'll sell that business probably for $500 million or something like that in a couple of years' time. But there's somebody who got out ahead of it. And he's obviously a very skilled manager, and he's an entrepreneur, and he knows how to do all this stuff. But when somebody's, when we spoke to him, he's actually married to my first cousin. And when I was speaking to him, when he's doing this initially, he had so many people in, that ran concrete businesses and concrete block businesses. And they were all like saying, oh, this is, a terrible idea and all this kind of stuff, because they wanted the status quo to remain the same, So it's always changing.
Yeah, and this is what I find. I was born in London. I love London as a city, but so many people, when I ask the question about London, do you think it's going to be sustainable? So from 1996 up to 2016, London grew 518%. We did so that's a close up history. We didn't have growth like that previously anywhere else, but there was loads of circumstances that went with that, the debt, the governments, and more money they kept on. As soon as they took the gold standard off in 1971, and we just started printing monies as a world nation, basically, America central bank started printing money. This had that massive impact. Everybody just borrowing more and more and more. The house prices grew 518%. And as I said, I go back to that same question earlier on. I say to people, do you think London can grow 518% again in the next sort of 20 years? Because I can't see how it will, myself personally. London's a historical town. I can't see it falling off a cliff either. But like, I say where, and people just go, it's always been good. I'm like, but just because it's been good in your recent history, don't mean that's sustainable going forward.
There's a couple of different ways to look at it. And I mean, first of all, we're all looking at things today and we're comparing it with recent past. And that is always a bit of a mistake in a sense, because when I bought my first property, I bought it for £85,000. And I sold that property for, £780,000 or whatever it was. So it multiplied by 10, basically, or close to 10 in the period that I held it. I also rented it for that period and to the same person. And for that same person paid me in rent 3 times what I paid for that property over the duration of that. So I basically made about 12x my money on that. But I can remember at the time that I bought it, the person who bought it before me paid 40,000 for it, and he thought I was mad buying it for 85. And when I bought my second property after that, I paid 390,000 for it. And I can remember my father-in-law saying to me, "You are mad. Like, what on earth are you thinking? That 390,000?" I sold that property 6 years later for 1.9 million. And so it's always, at the time, it seems completely ludicrous and it's unlikely to happen. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, with all of the money that's been printed to pay for this pandemic and all that kind of stuff, you have to wonder whether inflation is going to creep in, and you're going to start seeing, we've for years and years now, we've had this inflation, kept at 1 to 2% for years. So that has been kind of like basically the status quo for the last generation, has been keep interest rates at a nice low, steady, or inflation at a nice low level. Now we're into the situation where you have to wonder, will inflation start to kind of creep out of control? And if that is the case, then definitely prices will continue to go. And the 518%. Now, having said that, I remember I have, a memory that goes back to 1988, 1989. And I can remember very clearly the debt crisis, and the British Bank, the Central Bank of England was broken by a guy called George Soros. And I remember interest rates they ended up having to disconnect from, they had to devalue, they had to do all this kind of stuff. And I can remember interest rates shot up at the time to like 18% or 20%. And it was a really difficult time. Loads of people were wiped out in the property market. And the people who survived and managed to hang on to their property, they spent the next 5 or 7 years underwater, unable to sell because their mortgage was greater than their equity. And so, there's no guarantee that the price that you paid for your property today is going to be the price that it's worth tomorrow. Like, the market could run into difficulty and you could spend 4 or 5 years underwater, but then just as easily you could get lucky and you could just end up on the inflation train keeps going and it ends up like property prices double again. Very hard to say. I mean, it's a crystal ball, and that's why you need to look at a deal today. Does it work for you today? Don't be looking ahead and thinking, am I looking at capital growth? Am I looking at all of these kind of nice extras? Either it makes sense today and it's robust enough to make you money today. And then I think, do the deal if you want to do the deal. But, it would be kind of a wise man would kind of say, you know what, it's too much of a crystal ball gazing exercise. I'm just going to, tread carefully. But definitely the uncertainty produces opportunity. And that's something that we should all remember, is that the more uncertainty out there, the more opportunity there is to kind of find a way to kind of make a deal. You just got to get resourceful.
Yeah, for sure. And exactly that. Before we actually got on the live, we was talking about Tony Robbins. And one of the things I love that he says is it's not a lack of resources, it's a lack of resourcefulness that moves people forward. And in hard times, you have to be more resourceful. And sometimes that breeds even more resourcefulness and can move you forward. It's like always, there's two ways you can go with it. You can either just fold into it or get more resourceful. But I think this is a nice little segue into my next questions around sort of like mental toughness, sort of the mindset of this. I can't remember if we did talk about this before we started or afterwards, but I know you're big on we definitely spoke about this before, like now with the meditation, the mindset, understanding that. You said you went through that personal development journeys, but when you're young, you sort of, you feel invincible when you're young, don't you? So you kind of ignore it a little bit because you just think, okay, similar again with all your finances, it's not until you, I think as Oscar Wilde said it, the youth is wasted on the youth quite often. At the time when you've got the most energy, the time when you should be taking the most risk because you've got less to lose, you're kind of not doing it so much. Not everybody, but most people. But how did you transition into this mind space? How did you use mental toughness? Obviously, you're training for a Ironman at the moment. I've done a triathlon, I've done a mini triathlon, and that was a good training exercise. So an Ironman that takes a lot of mental toughness. So how does this all relate into your business, getting through the journey you had previously, and what sort of things do you use for your mental toughness at the moment?
Well, first of all, there's I went through that difficult period that I mentioned, and when I realized that I had to take ownership and I had to kind of like just own up that it was my fault, that I'm not blaming anyone else and only I can fix it. That was the first thing. You got to leave the ego behind. Okay, so I was traveling around the world in first class, and I owned a penthouse apartment in New York City, and I had assets all over the place. And that you have to kind of park all of that and say, look, some of those assets, I lost them to the banks. They confiscated them. Various things happened that was tough to deal with mentally. But what you've got to kind of say to yourself is, okay, what can I control? What is actually 100% under my control? I can't control interest rates. I can't control the economy. I can't control what somebody thinks of me. But I can control me and my mindset, and I can control the level of fitness that I have and all of that stuff. So I think about, first of all, what's within my control, and that's the first thing. One thing that I wanted to make sure is that I disconnected my financial success from my identity. Too many people, you only have to look at the property kind of investors in Instagram these days, and it's the Bentley or the Rolls Royce or whatever, and you can see all this kind of the trappings of wealth that they want to kind of to show off and to show you, and it might be this kind of subtle flash of the Rolex or whatever it is. All of that stuff builds weakness, and it builds this kind of dependency on people and what they think of you. And you've got to just be yourself, and you've got to think to yourself, I'm on this journey and I don't care what anyone else thinks about this journey. This journey, I want to get from A to B, and I want to be as, whatever your outcome is, whether it's financial success, whether it's whatever success it is that you want to get to, only you can achieve that. You might go and have to do certain unpleasant things to get there, whether it's training very, very hard. In my case, I'm up at 5 every morning, and I go out and I do an awful lot of physical training on my Ironman training, and I do a lot of burpees and stuff like that, which are, a lot of people find burpees difficult. I did 1,048 on the day of my birthday last August, and I did it in under 2 hours, and I was like patting myself on the back thinking, this is fantastic. A lot of people are like scratching their heads. What the hell is he at? Like, why would he do this to himself? But it's my personal goal that I set for myself. And I don't care what somebody else thinks. I don't care whether you think that that's foolish or not. I only care about that it's a goal that I set for myself, and I've achieved that goal. And I'm only comparing myself with who I was yesterday. I'm not comparing myself with you or some other person who flies first class and, drinks champagne all the time. Now, you might be more successful than that person financially, or that person might be more successful than you financially, but you don't know what's going on behind the scenes. Like, they might be in terribly poor health. They might have a wife who, cries herself to sleep every night because you're out gallivanting around town, and she's, terribly lonely and unhappy. You might have kids that won't speak to you in 10 years' time because you're so focused on your business. That you got to look at all of this in the round and say to yourself, okay, what is important to me, and what am I going to end up achieving at the other side of this 20-year journey or 30-year journey that you're on? And being this kind of flash in the pan that's super popular today, but next minute your wife is leaving you or something like that. You got to look at the whole overall picture and ask yourself, like, what is important? Does comparing yourself to other people, does that help in any way? I mean, you comparing yourself to me, like, I'm a couple of years older than you, and I had all of this great success. There's no benefit to you comparing yourself, because you've got to, first of all, think about, okay, I was in these circumstances where the banks would lend me 110% with a phone call. Okay, do you have the same facilities available to you? No, you don't. Therefore, you don't have. Were property prices growing 25% a year for you? No, they weren't. Therefore, don't compare yourself to me. I had a certain set of tools available to me that other people today don't, and therefore, it's just foolish to compare yourself. It's easy on the very outside to say, oh, well, geez, he managed to do all of this by the time he was this age. I mean, if that's the case, we all look at Richard Branson and we say, geez, he started Virgin Airlines at 35 or whatever it was. I mean, I'm a complete flop compared to him. But he had certain skills, and he had, certain things fall into alignment at the exact moment that it needed to. And he also was very lucky. He had to jump out of a balloon at one stage, and he could have died, and he was left for in the ocean when he did these transatlantic crossings and stuff. Like, his life could have been very different, but he just happened to kind of like survive the thing. Comparing yourself to other people doesn't do you any good. The only person you should compare yourself with is the one you were yesterday or a few years ago, and be aiming for an outcome that you can control, and you have a map that you can kind of decide that you're going in that direction, and it's fulfilling for you, not comparative to whatever somebody else is doing.
Fantastic answer, and I really like that. And I can see the time we're coming up to the end part of this, so this really leads well into a question. So I ask everybody this question, and it's a little mission. I'll tell you the idea behind the mission, but I'm going to ask you a question now, and I would like you, just the first thing that comes to your mind, answer it. So what do you want from life?
Impact is the first word that comes to mind, and by that I mean having an impact on other people's lives. It's funny how my motivation 15, 20 years ago was to make as much money as fast as possible, and the reality is that, like, when you have the money, it's actually not that important to you. It's actually the impact and the legacy that you'll leave. And so I think about impact and legacy, and I kind of think to myself, I survived a very difficult couple of years. Not everyone survived those years. I have 2 relatives who took their own lives, and there are multiple peers that were as successful, if not more successful than me, that could not face the kind of the negative aspects of their ego in the fall from grace that they had. And I know people that had private jets and helicopters that couldn't face it and took their lives. And you kind of say to yourself, wow, like, how bad does it have to get for somebody to go from owning a plane to taking their own lives? But it's very possible if you don't, pay attention to the stuff that matters. And so for me, it's making that, my mission is to get out there and to remind as many people that this is a business, not a lifestyle. A lot of people think it's a lifestyle, and that, getting into it and, look at me, I can do all of this, but you go and lose, stop paying attention for a couple of months, and kind of let your ego run amok, and you can find yourself in a very dark place very quickly. And so impact and legacy.
Excellent, great answer. And how would that make you feel? So, like on an emotional level, how would that make you feel achieving this?
Well, I would hope that one of the things that I pay attention to as a kind of a hobby is my family tree and my heritage. And I have this app on my phone called Ancestry, and on it you can put in your great grandfather and your great great grandfather and all of this kind of stuff. And it's brilliant because it goes off and it looks up the information online, and it comes back with hints, and it says your great grandfather was married on this day to your great grandmother, and all of this, and it does all of this for you. But what's really great is sometimes photographs emerge, and you start to build a picture of somebody that you know nothing about, but is a direct descendant or ancestor of yours, and you kind of say to yourself, wow, I had this great great grandfather, and he had been successful, he had built this business, he had done this, but he had also lived through the Irish Famine. And the Irish Famine was a really bad period of history in Irish history. It was 1845 to 1850, that 5-year period. The Irish population dropped from 8 million to 2 million. And 2 million people died, and another 4 million people emigrated to around the world. That's why so many Irish live in the UK and in America and stuff. And he survived that. And I try to imagine what he was like. And so it's his legacy is kind of still impacting me today, 150 years later. And I wonder to myself, okay, if I can go out there, if I can have this impact, if I can make an impact on people's lives, if I can create all this content that will survive. I mean, long after you and I are gone, Harvey, this thing that we're currently doing will be available out there. And so like right now, I'm saying hello to my great grandkids. Do you know what I mean? Like they could stumble upon this in 60 years time and be going, oh, look, there's granddad or great granddad or whatever. And that's the amazing thing about this technology that we're on, is that it doesn't die or go away. It's there now in the cloud for somebody else to stumble upon. And so I think about the message that we're making and what kind of impact it's going to have. And I think it'd feel pretty good if my great great grandkids find this interview and like, hey.
Yeah, that's amazing. So that's the same for me. What you said earlier on, there's a few things you said earlier on. The reason I asked this question is because I want to try. My mission is to try and give people a self-awareness, and I called it figuring out happy. Figuring out happy is a lifelong quest. What made you happy 15, 20 years ago when everything was flying is very different to what it is today. So we've constantly got to realign. It's like when you drive down a road, you just don't stay in the middle of the white lines. You're always just course correcting. And that's what life is for me. There's never going to be always happy. You're never going to be always sad. It's just about that course correction and learning yourself. So your training regime now at your age is definitely going to be different in another 10 years time, although I can imagine with your mindset you'll still probably be doing Ironmans. But that said, your training regime will have to change. So everything around us changes when we have kids, the economies. So my mission is, I call it figuring out happy. I feel everybody should understand the tools and the awareness of everything. As you said, there's always a trade-off. People often trade off going after business for their family and their marriages and things like that. And you've always got to be aware. I think, like, I've got my values. Number one is time, because I feel like time is always running out. We've all got 24 hours of a day, so time is our most precious commodity and our most expensive commodity we'll ever spend. So we should value our time. But number two is awareness, that self-awareness and awareness of things, or being able to step back and be aware of things when things happen. Because sometimes our ego overrules our awareness unconsciously. Just having that awareness. So my mission is to try and make people more aware, to think, look, you can look after your health, you can be aware of your family, your time and your wealth, and try and get that into a balance. You'll never get that perfect, but all the time you're aware, you can bring them levels that are lacking back to some level of normality. So that's the reason behind that big question. My nan, I'm mixed race. My dad's from the Caribbean. My mum's white. Well, I say white, but my nan's, I think it was a nan or her heritage anyway, come over in the Great Famine as well from Ireland. So I've got a little lineage from there somewhere. My wife just got that ancestry.com as well. So
you know what you should do is the DNA test. because that is amazing. I've done that now, and I have 550 cousins on Ancestry.com, and they're connecting with you, and you can it tells you that, this looks like you're a second cousin or a third cousin or whatever,
Unbelievable. Again, prop tech just disrupting the world. It's crazy, isn't it? When my wife's just going through it, she's only just got it recently, and you've seen them links go together. It's just unreal. But Gavin, I really want to thank you for your time today. It's been really enjoyable. I've learned a lot. And yeah, so where can everybody find you? I know you've got a great podcast. Where, as I said, when I was researching, you seem to be across everywhere. So what's the best places for people to find you? What would you encourage them to look at?
If you want to find me on social media, Gavin J. Gallagher is my handle for pretty much everything. J for James. In the case of my podcast, it's called Behind the Facade, and I deal with, as we're talking about, the mental and emotional and kind of the mental game, the mindset aspects of being a property developer, investor, and I also go a little bit into the innovation sector, and I've had a combination of just me talking about my thoughts and insights. And then I also bring in guests and I talk to them about some aspect of the business and sort of their thoughts. So I have some really good industry leaders on the podcast for discussions. So that's Behind the Facade. In terms of finding more out about me, I also have a website, so gavinjgallagher.com. And if you go in there /go, that'll bring you to a kind of an email list that you can sign up if you want to sort of find out more about me through events and things like that. Excellent.
Well, thank you for your time, Gavin. You've definitely found a loyal follower in me. I've been your podcast now. I've been looking at your stuff. So super interesting. And yeah, I look forward to speaking to you again in another clubhouse soon. And yeah, thank you very much for your time today, Gavin.
Harvey, it's been a real pleasure. Look forward to it, and stay positive.
Thank you, mate. Catch you soon.
Thank you.